picking up where we left off on part 1. Let's see if we can get this carburetor straightened out and get this car running right again. Alright, we got a problem with the carburetor. Classic Holly problem. What I think it is I think it has a broken power valve, which means it's basically dumping raw fuel into the car in an idle, and I'll show you why. Here's the idle mixture screw. It's closed. That's half open. It barely runs. Completely closed. It runs better. Same thing on the other side. This is cranked in all the way. If I move it out a half turn, it actually runs worse. So both screws cranked in all the way and it's still running. So that's definitely has a problem. Okay, so I pulled out 2 spark plugs from each side. The other 2 are right over here. And what I've got on each side, I've got a fouled out spark plug, and I have a clean spark plug, or one that's, you know, relatively tannish. That looks pretty good. Same thing on the other side. Same dealio. And you can see on this side, this goes to the outer cylinder, and that one's fouled out, and the one in the inner cylinder is clean, and it's just the opposite on the other side, which indicates an unbalanced carburetor. So on these semi-high performance manifolds that are really what they call dual plane or 180-degree manifolds, essentially what the manifold does is it allows each side of the carburetor to feed 2 outer cylinders, and then on the opposite side it's going to feed 2 inner cylinders. So you have and vice versa. So essentially, you if you have a problem like this, if you pull out 2 spark plugs side by side, so that means you'll be grabbing an inner one and an outer one. And if you've got them, you know, you have, you know, each one of them is black, and then it's opposite. You've got a black one on the inner on this side and a black one on the outer. That's a for sure you've got an unbalanced carburetor. It's very unlikely that's an ignition problem, or, you know, or a bad spark plug or anything like that. We already got this unbolted, so we're going to lift it off. Okay, real quick, since I already have it off the car and I've got the gaskets, and this thing hasn't been worked on in, oh, probably 10 years, I'm going to go ahead and remove the bowl and the metering body, primary metering body, and get in there and take a look at that power valve, because it sure was acting like it had a bad power valve. Pull these out. And the reason fuel's not running out is I dumped this thing upside down over a fuel container outside and caught the fuel, so I don't have gas gushing out everywhere when I take this apart. And a lot of times just take the handle of a screwdriver, just knock it loose. A lot of times that'll get it, sometimes it won't. There we go. So we got the bowl off, which is not a huge deal. There's the front of the power valve there. I'm going to have to get the metering body off to get back there and actually see if the power valve was any good or not. That gasket actually looks pretty good, not too bad. And again, the gaskets are old, but they were sealing just fine. The trick I do, if the car's been sitting for several months, is I like to prime the bowls with fuel the night before I start it if it's been sitting for several weeks, and let the gaskets soak up the fuel, and then it doesn't piss fuel everywhere when you start it up. And it's usually enough that it'll also saturate the O-rings and stuff. Sometimes these transfer tubes will leak a little if they've been sitting a while, and usually all they do is have to do is soak up some fuel. If they stop leaking, then they're probably still good. Now obviously if the car's a daily driver, or if it's just been sitting overnight and they're leaking, then, you know, that's not the problem. But just coming in here, I want to be real careful how I pry this off. A lot of times I'll come in and pry it off right here on this vacuum tube right here. A lot of times I can get in there with a screwdriver and just kind of gently pull it back. Usually they'll just come right off. There we go. And now I know a little fuel spills out with this transfer tube, but this O-ring is disintegrated. So either the fuel was making its way in. The O-ring doesn't look good. I don't think that was sealing very well. So the fuel was either making its way into this vacuum chamber through the bad power valve or through this hole right here where this transfer tube is supposed to seal. So this power valve here, a lot of times if you can put your thumb over it and see if it'll hold a vacuum. And this one feels like it's holding a vacuum. A lot of times just pressing it down, if you can put your thumb on it good enough and seal it. If I pull my thumb off, I can probably see that pop up just a little bit. Yeah, so that looks like to me it's holding a vacuum. Get my fingers down so you can see it come up. You can hear it. So I think the power valve is okay. I don't like the way this O-ring looks on this transfer tube though. It looks like that was having a problem. And sometimes they shrink up, they get old and they're just not going to seal. And that could have been the problem, but I think there's way too much fuel in there for that not to have had a problem. And there's the hole for the vacuum chamber where the vacuum enters right there. So if that is getting full of fuel, it's going to siphon it right into the car while it's running. And that'll make it run pig rich. And that'll make the idle screws, they won't respond. So good chance that was the problem. But probably while I have it out, I do have a new power valve. And I'm pretty sure I got new transfer tube O-rings. And I've got new gaskets. Although this gasket could probably be reused. But I'll probably go in and remove it and put a new gasket on. And it should be just fine. Both the primary and secondary high-speed air bleeds were partially plugged on the passenger side, which oddly is the PCV valve side, which is a phenomenon I've noticed on all three of my cars that have Holley carburetors. It shouldn't have affected idle quality because I don't think those nozzles would flow in idle, but it definitely would affect when those nozzles start flowing fuel when the engine's up to speed, off idle. I come in with this tube right here and spray. It's going to flush out, it's going to back flush the air bleed that way. Okay, that looks clear now, whereas before it wasn't. Sometimes you got to take them apart. I've gotten away several times with back flushing them from the top. You can also go in through the idle circuit holes and flush out the idle circuit, but we're going to flush this one out too. That looks good. Okay, so I know that's clear now. Okay. That feels good. So the only thing I have to do is hunt down some gaskets and some transfer tube O-rings, and we can button this thing back together and it'll be just fine. And when people talk about rebuilding a carburetor, these Holleys, other than the throttle blades, they don't have a lot of moving parts. You've got the power valve. There's your main metering jets. And then you want to make sure every one of these passages is clear. And you can do that by the same thing, taking the carb cleaner. There's my idle jets right there. So if I go in down here and blow in the bottom, that'll blow that jet out. You see it coming out just a little bit. Same thing over here. Blow that one out right there where I'm pointing my finger. There. And then all these little various holes, you just want to get your reading glasses out if you got 55-year-old eyes like me, and make sure none of these little passages are plugged. Any of these little bleeds in here, if they have a little piece of dirt on them, it'll make the car run like poo. So pretty simple metering device, the Holley carburetor. Not a lot of moving parts, very easy to service. So a rebuild is essentially just replacing these metering block gaskets. And because this is a 600 universal, it doesn't have a metering block in the back. It just has a metering plate. So the metering plate gasket also doubles as the fuel bowl gasket. And since I already have this apart, I'm probably going to replace the gasket on that end too, because I noticed the last time I primed this carb, there was a little bit of fuel weeping out the top of the bowl right there, because that's where the vent seal's up there. So after these have dried out several times and aged, a lot of times they'll tear on the top, but they'll still hold fuel. But when you prime them, if you prime the rear bowl, sometimes a little bit of fuel will spill out there. That's when you know those gaskets are kind of getting long in the tooth. So I got a collection of these gaskets, so it'll only take a few minutes to finish disassembling, clean it up, and then put it back together and put it on the car and see how it does. I think that problem will be solved. Okay, just sharing the little bit that I know about Holleys. This is the accelerator pump. That little red stem, I'm pretty sure, is a one-way valve. So after you've depressed the accelerator pump and it opens back up, it's going to draw fuel back in through there, and it's going to seal when you push on it. And when you're pushing on this pump, the fuel comes out of that little discharge hole there at the bottom of the float bowl, and it's attached here. When this is on the car, this is the primary metering body. That fuel coming out of there is going to travel through this hole right here, and it goes up this area right here, this tube. It exits through this transfer tube, because this is a later Holley design, okay? And when the fuel comes out of that transfer tube, it's going to come out through there, that hole right there, and it's going to exit that hole right there, and it's going to exit through the discharge nozzles. It's kind of hard to see because of the choke butterfly, but you see that Phillips head screw? That's the accelerator booster, and there's a little nozzle on each side on this one, and it's kind of hard to see. I think if I turn it around, maybe you can see it. I'm trying to point to it with a screwdriver. There's the discharge nozzles right there. There's one there and one there. And the only thing those are doing is when you step on the gas and open the butterflies like that, the engine's going to immediately lean out and try to stumble. The only thing that's happening when you work the accelerator pump is it dumps a little bit of fuel down each one of those primary throats, enriches the mixture to keep the engine from stalling. That's all the accelerator pump system does. But when you have a problem, like when you have a transfer tube O-ring that is dried out and shrunk, and you've got this vacuum chamber with that hole right there that I pointed to before. I'll use a screwdriver, that's better to do that. That's where the vacuum is pulled on this vacuum chamber here. That's what operates the power valve. When there's a vacuum applied to this diaphragm, it moves this in and out to richen and lean the mixture for the car. It just senses load based on vacuum. Drop in vacuum will open the valve, and when you have an increase in vacuum when you're cruising, it will close the valve. But what happens is if this diaphragm has a hole in it, it's going to allow fuel to leak out through here on the float bowl side. It'll just make its way past the valve, and it'll dump into this vacuum chamber. Same thing happens when that transfer tube O-ring fails. And what happens is that vacuum chamber gets full of fuel, and that hole right there, which exits out right there, is going to dump raw fuel right into the engine. Make it run like poo. And then you have the raw fuel dumping in there, and basically it's just making the engine run just pig rich, and it'll hardly idle. It'll run terrible, and it'll load up the spark plugs. So I suspect I had at least a plugged air bleed going on, because I couldn't get it fully unclogged just by blowing the top of it out. So most of the time that works, but that one must have got varnished up good. We had a couple of summers where we ran it up here before we switched over to Rec 90, and the fuel just boils out of the carb. I've tried using a phenolic spacer. I've used the AMC Jeep style fuel filter with the vapor nipple to try to keep the fuel from boiling in the fuel line. I've done all of that, and the only thing that seemed to fix it was running Rec 90 in it. And whatever additive they don't put in fuel that has ethanol, it lowers the boiling point. And it's a problem on carburetors because fuel under pressure is less likely to boil. But I can actually see the fuel boiling out of the air bleeds if you shut the car off. 5 or 10 minutes later, raise the hood, take the air cleaner off, you can actually see the fuel coming out of the air bleeds. And what happens is that fuel constantly bubbling out, it varnishes over after a while because it leaves residue, and it plugs those air bleeds, and that will also cause it to run pig rich. So probably just several seasons of doing that, it probably got varnished up enough in there that I couldn't get it off from just flushing out on the top. But definitely coming out through there, we saw how well we blew that out. So I'm going to go ahead and just replace the gaskets, replace the power valve, which probably doesn't need replacing, but since it's a part, and this hasn't been a part in a decade, while it's sitting on the bench, I may as well just do it, and there's one less thing to worry about. Okay, showing you what a healthy O-ring should look like. This came out of the metering block end of the transfer tube area. This came out really hard. I actually had to use 2 blocks of wood to get it out. I couldn't get it out with my fingers. But there's the one that was squished, that was in the carburetor main body. And then here's what it should look like. So I think my hypothesis is right. I think what happened is, I think this was drawing fuel out of the accelerator pump to the vacuum chamber right here, because this thing was just setting in. It just comes right out. See that? Look at that. See, these go in really hard. See, if I try to put it in, see, these will go in either way, but you see these go in pretty hard. You have to lube them to get them to go in, and this thing had just gone away with time. So actually what it was doing is it was drawing fuel out of the accelerator circuit and pumping it down through there. That was probably the main problem. If you take one out and an O-ring looks like that, it's definitely not sealing, because that's what it's supposed to look like, a healthy one. Why this side died and this one didn't, I don't know. Maybe it has something to do with how hot it gets on that end of the carb, or how it's submerged in fuel. I don't quite understand why that is the case, but I've got fresh O-rings, and while I'm at it, I'm going to put on a fresh accelerator pump. That's what that is, accelerator pump diaphragm. We'll do that. And then I got a new power valve with a new gasket. So we'll go ahead and basically do just a basic rebuild. We'll freshen this up, and then I'll have to make sure I got the correct size O-rings in the kit, which I'm sure I do. I just have to make sure I grab the right ones. I'm pretty sure that's the one that goes over there. That looks like it. So we'll probably have to just wedge these old ones off and then match them. This one's in pretty good shape, so if I can get this one off, that'll give me a pretty good idea of what size I need to chase. It's been about a decade since this carburetor was apart, and I used the Holly Blue, I don't know if they call them no stick or permaseal gaskets, whatever they are. And I put a little WD-40 on both sides before I assemble them, and it really aids in disassembly, so it saves on all that cutting and scraping. And when they're torqued down properly, they never leak. It's amazing. And that gasket probably was still reusable, but because every time I had to buy a gasket set to repair one thing on the carburetor, I kind of ended up with a collection of gaskets. I think you can buy these gaskets in blister packs too. So just making sure all the holes line up, and they do. So a lot of times what you want to do is take the old one and put it over the new one, and make sure you don't see any new blue on the other side where there should be a hole. So all the holes line up, so that's good. And we got our transfer tube ready to go. I'm going to lube those a little bit with probably WD-40 to aid sliding them in, but you can see how more that protrudes now. You can see I got a little bit of teeth marks there, trying to pull out with pliers, and having to put it between a block of wood to get it out of the metering body. But it doesn't hurt anything. The sealing surface is where the O-rings are, and that's going to go right in here on that end. And I can tell by how that's going in now. The other one would just fall in. This one you have to really have to press on it. Okay, we're at day 2. I had to take a break because we were tired. We actually came back from the Huntsville All Mopar show yesterday. We basically had to limp the thing home. It was running terrible when we started it up in the morning. Just didn't have time to overhaul the carburetor. So anyway, getting back here, I'm just going to take this power valve out. You just need a 1-inch wrench. They come out pretty easy. You don't want to use a lot of leverage on these because you'll just strip the threads. I think this is a die-cast zinc metering block, and it's got a fiber washer on it. It's a seal. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with this one, but since I'm going ahead and taking it apart, there's a brand new power valve. It's rated at I think 6.5 inches of vacuum. So at I guess at that number, 6.5 inches, that's when this valve is going to start to open and enrich the fuel mixture. And we're just going to put it in dry. There's no need to lube it or anything. Just want to make sure the gasket's lined up, and just thread it in. And then just take the 1-inch wrench and just snug it up. Again, you don't have to go crazy with it because there's a lot of leverage here. Just like that. That's seated in firmly. That's all it takes. They rarely loosen up. So valve body's in good shape. It's got a new power valve. So well, we got that done. I went through my kit and I found 2 actually 3 good O-rings. These go on the transfer tube that transfers the fuel from the front float bolt to the rear. So we're going to replace those out. But before we do that, I'll go ahead and change out. This is all the accelerator pump is. It's just a diaphragm with a fiber gasket on the back side of it. So we'll go ahead and take this off. And these were like just really loose, but it's been probably a decade. Look at that, that one just fell out. But it was sealed. You know, it's been on there a long time. But you want to put these on pretty firm, because the gasket sometimes will compress and relax a little bit, and you can't tighten these up when the carb is on the manifold. So you have to remove the carburetor to re-torque these if they get loose. Sometimes they'll leak right where it meets the base of the ball. And there was nothing wrong with this accelerator pump. It wasn't leaking, but we're just going to kind of go ahead and do what they would consider, I think this is like a basic rebuild. I'm not going to completely disassemble the carb because there's some things you don't really need to disassemble. It's just if you were replacing something, you would need the gasket. Like, for example, if you were replacing the essentially the throttle body. If you were going to take that off of the base of the carburetor, there's a big base gasket that looks like this that would go in between the main body and this. But unless you're replacing this because the bushings are worn out or something, there's really no need to remove that to do a basic rebuild. Same thing with the accelerator pump discharge nozzles. There's a little check ball in there. When you take that off, you have to be careful not to lose it. And there's a little tiny gasket that goes in between that and the main body of the carburetor. But unless that accelerator pump system has a problem, there's really no need to disassemble it. So I'm going to leave that as is, and I'm just going to pop off this old accelerator pump. And sometimes that you got to work on it to get them to come off. There we go. You can see that one was getting a little gummy. It had some wear on it, but it's working just fine. That pump was still good. It wasn't leaking or anything. I don't think it was really causing problems. And usually they just peel right off. Okay, there's the spring, and here is the one-way little rubber diaphragm that's in there, which keeps you from pumping fuel back into the bowl. And usually you can pull those out. I don't know if I can get that new one in there without having to remove the spring and pull it through. We'll see. Yeah, it's going to make me work for it. I'm going to have to take the float bowl out and remove that spring, I think, so I can get in there and pull that through. Because I don't think I'm going to be able to get this to go on with just my fingers. They go on pretty hard. Yep, she's not going to go through. So we'll go ahead and take the float bowl off real quick. It's just got a little tiny circlip, and I'm just going to get that off, and hopefully I don't catapult that across the room when I do it too. Okay, just coming in here. I'm going to just take, I got a sharpened cheap screwdriver that I use as a little punch thingy. The clip just fell down in the bowl. That way we know it's not going to go anywhere. I don't know if I can get the bowl out with the needle and seat in. Oh yeah, it looks like I can. Yeah, it's been so long since I took one of these apart, and I think the spring will slide right out with that. We don't want to damage the spring. Okay, and there's our new check valve, flapper valve, whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to grab it with my fingers and press down at the same time. See if I can just get it to pull through. Boy, that one really doesn't want to go in. I forgot how hard it is to get those to pull through. I don't want to break the little stopper off. I just broke the tip of it off. Having trouble getting that one to go in. Feels like I almost got it. That just doesn't want to go. Just kind of working it with my thumb. You see it's almost pulled in right there. It's got one spot that doesn't want to go. Okay, I think I got it. It went through. Okay. There, I don't know if you can see that good enough or not. If I pull down on that, you can see the little notch where it came through. So that's how you know you got it all the way through. So that's on there, that's seated. You see the little hole there. When that thing's pulled off its seat, that's where the fuel comes in at from the bowl. And then of course when you mash the pump down, it's going to push this back down and keep from pumping the fuel into the bowl. You're going to want it to come out of that exit port right there, what we showed earlier. I'm just going to pull off the old gasket. Hopefully this comes off without too much grief. I got to say, putting a little bit of WD-40 on these, it really makes all the difference in the world. And I've never really had any sealing problems with them. And there's just a little bit of residue on there. If I was really fussy, I could grab a bronze brush, something that's not real aggressive, and just kind of just work that off. Carb cleaner will help get that off too, but that cleaned up so good, I wouldn't even bother with that. The only thing I make sure is I don't have any grit in the bowl from doing that, because it'll find its way into the metering body and give you a grief. But that's pretty good. I'm not going to worry too much about that. A little bit of smuts right there isn't going to cause They shouldn't cause any sealing issues. So we'll just take our new, I think we got a new blue gasket. I like the blue ones better. They seal really good. Just make sure it lines up with that exit port right there. And it does. And sometimes these gaskets have other things on them for like other applications. But the only thing that's going to happen is these bowl screws, they're going to catch these two holes coming through here. Like that. And then the top one, it's just going to go through the cutout like that. And that'll work just fine. Moving things along, but just to show you, these fiber washers that they use, those are leak prone, but as long as they're not crumbling and falling apart, there's no need to dig them out. I'll just leave them. I'm just doing a quick rebuild here because I want to see if this carburetor is actually going to function like I think it will when I'm done with it. And we don't have to show you putting the float bowl back in. There's my little circlip, which I almost lost. It's a little fella. And again, this is just going to slide in like this. They got a notch here. And that spring will go right over that diaphragm and go right in. Just like that. Just make sure it's centered. That works as intended. Get that over just a little bit. Yep, that's working just fine. And I don't know if I have a extra needle and seat. These come out really easy. There's a window right here, which I think you can just lift out to show it. I don't know if I want to wreck this or not. They come out kind of hard. Oh yeah, we'll pull it out. There's the needle and seat. You can see the needle right there. And that's how that works. It's almost like a toilet bowl. There's your float. And it just, as the fuel bowl fills up with fuel, there's your inlet. It's going to push that needle up into the seat and shut the fuel flow off so you don't flood the car out. And that's all that does. And this just screws out when you replace it. And what's nice about these later Hollies, of course they call them later, but they probably made this change 35 or 40 years ago, is if you do have a needle and seat that gets clogged, if banging on it with a screwdriver like that won't unseat it, sometimes you get a little piece of trash in there, you can just unscrew this needle and seat and remove it, blow it out and install it back in. You can do that on the car. That saved me a couple of times. I'm going to be real careful with this flat tip screwdriver. I'm just going to come in and just get this going. I probably should have some kind of plastic tool. Oh, there we go. That one was rock hard. That came out really easy. And it's compressed. It's old. So, but I know we've got two new ones here. They're in really good shape. And we'll put those on the tube. They just slide right on like that. Put the other one on here. That goes right on. This tube's actually a little scrungy. Yeah, it's not too bad. Okay. So it's got two new O-rings on this fuel transfer tube. I can't remember the correct name for this, but it just links the two bowls together. The front bowl feeds the rear one. So that'll be good to go. What we are going to have to do though, it's got these goofy clutch head screws, which a screwdriver generally fits into it. I just don't remember what size. Yeah, it's one of these. These usually are already relaxed by the time you remove them. And just pointing up here, see how this is sawed through? It kind of broke loose. This gasket right here, it's I believe it serves as I think there's two gaskets on here, but this main outer part of this does the same job that a fuel bowl gasket would do, and one that has a primary block. And you see how this one's gone away. So that was getting ready to have a problem. But as long as it seals on the outside, it's okay. But you can see this one had seen better days. this comes off. I'll try to peel it off if I can. I might take a screwdriver and just help it out a little bit right here on one of the ears, if I can get it underneath a little bit. These are on here pretty good. Stuck on pretty good. Okay. Peel that one back. We got that. All right. This one's on here pretty good. So we can get her to peel off without making a huge mess. It came off pretty clean. Okay, I'm wrong on this one. This one just uses one piece of gasket. At least that's how I put it together last time. And you can see there's the remnants of those brown style ones. Those are really difficult to get off. But as long as you get them off pretty good, you're usually not going to have sealing problems. That doesn't look too bad. A lot of times you'll create more problems by trying to clean all this up because you may end up plugging one of these passages. It's kind of a pain, but that's scraped off good enough. I'm not going to have any sealing issues. So we can take our new gasket and make sure that, again, like, you know, we don't have any places where there's supposed to be holes that there isn't. So we know we got a good one there. And depending on year and model of these, sometimes where those little holes are may change. But that should go right over it. We'll put that back together. It'll be just fine. You know, again, if I was looking to be super meticulous, I would get that little bit. Actually, that does look kind of nasty. That's softened up over the years. This was impossible to get off. The last time I had it apart was probably 10 years ago. I'm getting off with my nails now. I probably should go in with a soft bristle brush and try to get some of this off. But I'm going to have to blow all these passages out now because I risk getting these holes plugged with something that I don't want plugged. So we'll go in and we'll clean that up best we can. We're just going to hit this with a little WD-40. Just like that. We'll take our metering plate. We're going to set that. There's two locating tangs, which I think are there and there. Okay, just like that. Replace our clutch head screws. Torque them down, and then we can put the rear float bowl on. All right, we're just snugging them up. You can't get them on super snug with this tiny screwdriver, but you know, again, doesn't have to really be Gorilla Force because you can't really use Gorilla Force on a screwdriver this small, but they do need to be on there good and snug. You don't have any leaks, internal leaks. Okay, that's on good. I'm going to go ahead and install the rear bowl. Again, checking these washers. If these were chipped or flaking apart, I would dig these out and put new ones in. But I'm going to go ahead and just reuse them because I know they're not going to leak. Just getting those started. I'll tell you, when they went to these, I think they're 5/16 socket head screws, whatever you call them. These are so much easier to do than those blade screws that the earlier ones had. Those were always kind of a pain. But put those on good and snug and get a good seal. Especially knowing I got a little bit of oil on each side, which most of it will flush out when there's fuel going through it. But on those mating surfaces where you get it good and snug and it can't wash all of it away, it will wash it away in time, but it seems like there's always just enough residue left that when you have to take these apart even a decade later, you're not stuck having to do all that nasty scraping stuff. Even though that's what I did on this one. When we shut the camera off, I went ahead and cleaned the back of that up. You probably noticed that when I put the gasket on. I couldn't take it because it was just too gross. All right, so those are on good and snug. I'm going to go ahead and take this transfer tube and try to get it started, and putting a little bit of WD-40 on these, it seems to greatly simplify the installation process. These you got to be careful because a lot of times they'll twist on you, they'll get cocked in the bore, and they're not going to seat in properly, and then you'll have a problem. And I probably still, oh, that went in so nice. I don't know if you guys can see it with the camera or not, but you always want to check around here and make sure there's not a piece of O-ring sticking out. Sometimes they'll go in sideways, and you get the whole thing back together, and you'll put it in. As soon as you start it up, it'll start spraying fuel everywhere. Disaster. So looks like I got that one centered right. Next thing to do, take my metering body gasket, and seeing how I've got one hole. I'm not sure why that's like that. Looks like there is a front and a back with this one for some reason. There's a hole over here. I'm not sure why that's there. Oh, that's a locating hole. Pretty sure it is. Right there. So that only goes on one way. There's our locating hole right there for that. That's going to go in just like that. So we'll go ahead and just lube this up real quick. Do the same thing I did on the other one. Just give it just a light coating of oil. I've always used WD-40 on these. I've never had leak problems. They always seem to work out just fine. And it really makes these any of the gaskets come apart easier, particularly these blue ones. I've had really good luck with these when you do have to take them apart. Oh, tell you what I almost did. That would have been a disaster. We want to go ahead and get our accelerator pump transfer tube. We want to lube those O-rings up. We want to go ahead and press those in. That should go in just like this. Yeah, that went in so nice. And that one's going to go in right there like we showed earlier. Just like that. And we've got our locating. Okay, that's located. That's pressed in. It's got a nice firm fit. And then I can take my new blue gasket. And it looks like they set these up so you can't screw them up. It looks like you get the accelerator pump slot on either side, which is cool. And this spare gasket I'm putting on, it's probably over 10 years old, but they've been in a climate controlled closet, so I don't think we'll have any problems with that. This all looks nice. Cleaned all that up. So let's see if I can get. Can I just rest it on? Oh yeah, those are locating tangs. I forgot about that. So we'll put those on right just like that. Oh, that makes that so much easier. There's a locating tang there too. I forgot about that. It's been so long since I had one of these apart. You know, when you keep them clean, they're very reliable. These fuel mixers, when they're put together right and set up, you very rarely have to fiddle with them after you get them together. And something I got to remember, I'm going to have to get this accelerator pump arm. It has to go on top of this. That's always a little bit of a chore to get that to go, to get that to line up. And I got to line up with this tube here. Showing you what I'm doing here. I got to grab this transfer tube here. A lot of times this is where you run into problems. So got that down like that. Trying to get my tube to line up. I think that tube will slide in for me. There we go. Now I also want to do the same thing. Putting the WD-40 on helps. I don't know if you can see down in there real good where my thumb is. But you can see right there, you can see shiny metal all the way around. I'll get out my pointer. Right in there is critical. If you have a problem with that O-ring, if you can see any rubber sticking out, you know it was cocked in the bore and it's not going to seal. You're going to have a leak problem. So really critical on the Hollies, those transfer tube O-rings or whatever you call them. If they're not in good shape or seated right, you're going to have leaks immediately. Like a lot of leaks. It's not just like usually a trickle. Usually it's fuel spraying everywhere. Okay, I got my cam arm on top of my pump lever. That went in like it was supposed to. So I can go in and snug these up. And really, other than I haven't taken the vacuum secondary diaphragm assembly off and shown how that works, I've pretty much covered what a basic rebuild is on one of these. Again, you know, removing the throttle body from the main, unless there's some issue with the gasket itself, which is pretty rare. You see how this is all pulling up nice as I'm doing this, seating the transfer tube in. Get these good and snug so we don't have any leaks. Okay, those are pretty snug. And I think even on this car, I can get to the rear bowls and tighten them if I have to, if I use a ratchet. Something happens and they're not tight enough, you can get back in here and get in there and do your business. So I like to have these pretty snug in the front and rear. Just hit it with that a little bit, but usually as tight as you can get with a nut driver usually is good enough. I'm not putting a lot of force on these, but you do want to make sure they're seated down really good, because they do have a tendency to relax a little bit with age. And if you don't use the car as a daily driver, when the fuel dries up out of the bowls, the gaskets are going to shrink after a while, and the fuel that they soak up to replace whatever those fiber gaskets are made out of, they'll shrink and they'll leak on you. That's why I like to prime them. And I'm also going to do this after we set this on the car. I'm going to put 2 ounces of fuel in each bowl, and then pour a little down the primary throat on each side before I fire it up, and that'll save a lot of wear and tear on the starter. It should just come right back to life when we get it back on the car. So that's that was kind of a half-ass rebuild. This is the Accelerator Diaphragm. I'm not the Accelerator, I'm sorry. This is the secondary diaphragm, and you can check these to make sure they're in good condition just by working them back and forth a little bit. These diaphragms will harden with age, and they will get to the point that they won't open up the secondaries. So, but I can just tell by the way this one feels and springs back, I can tell by the tension that diaphragm's in good shape. So just to save on time today, I want to get this car back together. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and just take this out and show how that's done. But that's a pretty basic thing to do right there. So this should get this car back together and running. I think my hypothesis is right. I think that transfer tube for the accelerator pump was filling the vacuum chamber up with fuel and making the car run pig rich. So let's put it on the car and see what happens. Hey, just showing you, this is the secondaries, and you can see the idle transfer slot is just barely covered when these are closed. I have these cracked open just a little bit to try to keep the primary throttle bores. I'm trying to make the transfer slots least exposed as possible, trying to go for that, you know, perfectly square transfer slot exposure. You can see there's a transfer slot there. It's a little dirty. Sometimes it's necessary to do that on an engine, especially like this Duster where it's a low compression engine with kind of a hot cam. You're going to need a little more primary opening to keep it running, and if you expose too much transfer slot, it's going to run a tad on the rich side of the idle. It's going to be hard to adjust the idle mixture screws. They won't respond very well, and then you'll also have idling problems, especially if you have an automatic. That feels like it's running satisfactory now. I know the spark plugs are still loaded up a little bit because it ran awful rich. I had to drive it all the way home from Huntsville. We limped it home running like that. It seems to be doing just fine now. We need to get it up to temperature before I can make the final adjustments on the carburetor, but it's running good. Just until I got it fixed, I'll take it in all the way on this side. It's not unusual for them to keep running on one side, but if I crank this one in, she'll shut right down. There we go. Okay, with it up to temperature, we're just going to make our final mixture setting adjustments. And coming in over here, we'll check the other side, check the final mixture setting. If I come in here and pull this in, yeah, she barely runs now. is about where I had it set it before. It's running good. I think it's fixed. Okay, for their final mixture settings, you can see she's not running black anymore. It was definitely drawing fuel out of the accelerator pump transfer tube. Clean that right up. It's running good. This just bugs me. See how that needle's wavering? It didn't do that before I put that new alternator in. I've also swapped out the voltage regulator, and it makes this weird whistling, humming noise. Probably can't hear it inside that passenger compartment. Let's see if I can get it to do it outside the car. Okay, I got the Tough Stuff alternator off and got the other alternator back in, which was probably working just fine anyway. It was probably just all the wiring stuff that we showed you. So let's fire this one up and see how it does. Let's see if I still have a wavering needle. Contact. And it'll take a minute to steady. There we go, coming right back down. I don't see that needle bouncing all over the place, do you? Sounds good to me. Just throw in reverse. Well, look at that. How many RPMs we turning? 800? Look at that. Let's put the lights on. Well, it's barely dropping. The $40 Advanced Auto alternator seems to be doing better. Now she wavers just a little bit because she's struggling a little bit. But watch what happens when we put this thing out of gear. Make it like that. We're on about 890 with the lights on, everything. She's doing just fine. Huh. What happens when we put the AC on? Doesn't seem to care. That's with the lights on. Now she's going to drop a little in reverse, I'm sure. Maybe about the same as before. But that's a lot of load on it. We just started it up. Lights off in gear. Of course, you know, it does have an idle solenoid, so I did just flip the throttle. We put it in gear now. Yeah. Yeah, she'll hold 800 in gear with the idle solenoid on, which goes on when I kick the AC on. Let's put the lights on now. Not too bad. Now we're only losing maybe, what, 5 to 6 amps at idle? That's very acceptable. With the lights off, she's actually putting out a charging gear with the air on. Huh. Quite a bit more. And I don't hear that weird whistle sound anymore. Yep. That alternator has something wrong with it. mean, this car's working as good as new now. It's idling just a tad high. When she gets warmed up, the idle comes down just a little bit, but nonetheless, throwing it in reverse is working. It takes more horsepower to run reverse, and then you also got reverse lights. Needle doesn't even move. Look at that. Put the lights on. And then put it in drive without the reverse on. She's still operating a little bit of a plusage. Huh. And we're at 800. I'd say that old stock $40 rebuild is feeding a lot more than that $200 something one did. Huh. I think that's called took. Now that we got the old Duster dialed in so she's running and driving better than ever, we're going to use it for its intended purpose, driving to the ice cream parlor on Sunday. Hit like and subscribe. This thing's running so good, I'm not sure when you'll see this car again.